Welcome, everyone. This is webinar 4 of the Cognitive Training webinar series. Today's webinar will focus on cognitive training, moderators, and mediators. I am Melissa Treviño from the National Institute on Aging and the NIH, and I am part of the steering committee for this series. I want to acknowledge the entire steering committee who has been providing scientific oversight for the series. Today, we will have 4 speakers who will speak for 15 minutes, followed by a moderated discussion and then a general discussion. So please mute yourself and use the chat function to ask your questions. Our moderator today, Dr. Powell, will ask your question during the general discussion portion. Webinars will be recorded and posted online, as well as a summary report will also be shared. The previous 2 webinars of the series focus on underlying mechanisms and transfer effects and outcomes. Speakers had discussed cognitive training mediators, from discussing what kind of brain circuitry, mechanistic changes, or behavioral processes may explain the effect of cognitive training outcomes. And speakers have also discussed moderators and looking at various cognitive training ingredients. Today, we will have a more in-depth discussion on mediators and moderators, and for moderators, discussing factors influencing the efficacy of cognitive training, from external environment, intervention properties, and individual properties. In order to address our key questions for today, for whom does cognitive training work and why, and in what context? I would now like to welcome our moderator, Dr. Powell from the Albert Einstein College of Medicine. Dr. Powell.
Thank you. I will be brief. I'm just going to quickly introduce our 4 panelists, who will be Dr. George Rebok, Dr. Anja Pahor, Dr. Chandramallika Basak, and Dr. Ben Katz, in, I believe, that order. I will not say more about them. You'll see their institutional identification on their slides. Dr. Rebok, please lead us on.
Thank you, Dr. Powell. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm George Rebok, and I'm pleased and honored to be part of this exciting series and share with you some of our recent work on the moderation and mediation of cognitive training effects, the theme of today's webinar, and thank you all for being here with us today. The topic of my talk today is social determinants of health as moderators and mediators of cognitive training effects, and posing the question of, does where you live, work, play, and age matter? So what are the social determinants of health? These are the conditions in which people are born, grow, live, work, play, and age, and the wider set of forces and systems that shape the conditions of everyday life. In our context, you can think about these factors as non-medical social factors affecting health outcomes, including cognitive health outcomes. And these factors include childhood adverse experiences and trauma, presence or absence of supported social connections, stigma, discrimination, issues related to education, financial status, employment, transportation, housing, food, and a myriad of other factors. And these social determinants may affect the risk of Alzheimer's disease and related dementias, or ADRD, and cognition either directly or indirectly. And they may moderate or mediate the effects of cognitive training on cognitive health outcomes. Now, the Healthy People 2030 report grouped these social determinants of health into 5 domains that you see here in the graph: economic stability, education access and quality, healthcare access and quality, neighborhood and built environment, and social and community context. Now, within the context of the active trial, which I'll describe in a little bit more detail later, we operationalized these social determinants of health, and Olivia Clay from our team led this effort. we used principal components extraction with Varimax rotation to derive factors that took a wide variety of measures and factor analyzed them into the 5 different domains. And we use 4 different sources of information to do that. Active survey data. We use occupational data that was coded by the Dictionary of Occupational Titles into the complexity of work with people, ideas, and things. Also census tract data and data from the North American Industrial Classification System. And here you see the measures and the domains of the social determinants of health that we used. Here you see the association of social determinants of health with the active cognitive composites, and this was speed of processing, memory, and reasoning, as well as mental health-related quality of life and physical health-related quality of life from the SF-36. And you see here in the slide that across all 5 of these domains, there were significant associations, covariate adjusted associations with the 3 cognitive composites and the quality of life. Most notably, you see that for the health care and access quality, there were significant associations across all 5 measures. And the highest associations strongest associations were with reasoning for health, economic stability and health access and quality. Now, ACTIVE was a large cognitive intervention trial that asked the question of, does intervening on basic cognitive abilities transfer to real-world tasks? You see the design of the trial here on the left-hand side of the slide. Following extensive baseline measurements, there was randomization in one of 4 treatment conditions, either memory, reasoning, speed of processing, or a no-contact control, followed up by post-tests through 10 years, as well as booster interventions 1 and 3 years past after the initial intervention. And then we did a 20-year follow-up where we related the active survey data to large secondary data sources like Medicare claims records and National Death Index records. And you can see here on the right-hand side of the slide that this was a very large trial, over 2,800 participants. The range of age was 65 to 94. These were all community dwelling participants, 1/4 of whom were African American. They all tested normal cognitively at baseline, and it was a trial that was funded by the National Institute of Aging and the National Institute of Nursing Research. So here are the 3 interventions. Memory intervention focused on verbal episodic memory and teaching mnemonic strategies. Reasoning focused on ability to solve problems that follow a serial pattern or order. Speed of processing was computer-based, focusing on visual search skills and ability to identify visual information under divided attention conditions. And then we had a passive no-contact control condition. Here's the conceptual model for ACTIVE. There was, after randomization, training on the proximal outcomes, the basic cognitive abilities, with transfer predicted to everyday functional performance, which were the primary outcomes of the trial, and then more distally, the secondary outcomes with things like health-related quality of life and health service utilization. And we were also very interested in individual differences and how they would impact on training effectiveness, things like cognitive ability, sensory ability, disease status, demographics, and so forth. More recently, we've become increasingly interested in looking at contextual social determinants of health as potential variables that might moderate training effectiveness. We published a series of papers in a special issue on the ACTIVE trial that asked the question of how much training is needed and who benefits. And this was led by the 3 intervention PIs of the trial, myself, Sherry Willis, and Carleen Ball. And just to summarize these findings, many of the predictors were intervention specific. For the memory training, we found that higher education and better self-rated health were associated with greater change in memory performance following training. So kind of supporting a amplification model, I guess. With the reasoning training, lower education, higher cognitive status predicted more reasoning training gains. For speed of processing, none of these factors was significant as a predictor, and neither age nor sex were significant predictors of training gain for any of the three active interventions. One of the factors that we become increasingly interested in is sensory difficulties and how they impact on training. And we published a review about a couple years ago in Alzheimer's and Dementia that concluded that in cognitive training studies, many people are excluded because of sensory deficits, and almost 90% of the studies don't even report how they measured things like vision and hearing. And we looked at vision difficulty, near vision difficulty, self-reported. And here in the slide, you see that the benefit of reasoning training was smaller for participants with near vision difficulty versus those without near vision difficulty. So, and this is a factor. Vision is a factor that's recently been added as one of the risk factors in older age for dementia. So this is very important to study sensory loss in terms of training effects. The question of how much training is needed, this is something we paid a lot of attention to. Here you see mean estimated composite memory performance over time in the memory training intervention based on the adherence to training. Adherence A is adherence to the initial training. Adherence B is to the booster training. And those participants who were non-adherent to the initial training, this lower line here, fared the worst in terms of their memory performance. So if you were adherent to the initial training, or either you're adherent or non-adherent to the booster training, you did better than the participants who are non-adherent. We've also looked beyond just individual level factors to neighborhood predictors of cognitive training outcomes. And in the upper part of the slide here, you see that you're looking at reasoning training gain in participants who either lived in a major city or who were not living in a major city. And contrary to our hypothesis, folks who were living in a rural area actually made greater training gains and showed greater maintenance over time than those who lived in a city area, maybe because of under-resourced environment and they had more to gain. But it's interesting that we found these differences by urbanicity. And in the lower part of the slide here, you see neighborhood socioeconomic position with everyday cognition in speed of processing, both in the intervention group and the control group. Participants who had high neighborhood socioeconomic position made greater gains and maintenance of gains over time than those who were lower in socioeconomic position. Now, we published a special supplement issue on the active 20-year follow-up, and we also received funding from the NIA for an administrative supplement to particularly focus in on the moderating role of social determinants of health on cognitive training. And we're particularly interested in dementia outcomes, since this was one of the primary outcomes of the 20-year study. And we had looked at dementia prevention in active, but always using algorithmic definitions that relied on survey data. In this case, we used administrative claims data from Medicare records over a 20-year period. The outcome of interest was defined by chronic conditions warehouse, using a dementia-related claim by the presence of either an ICD-9 or 10 code in any patient setting. And these claims records have high sensitivity and high specificity for the diagnosis of ADRD. And here you see a rather busy slide looking at the hazard ratios of diagnosed ADRD with social determinants of health, health scores as moderators of training. And I'd like to draw your attention to the parentheses here and the arrows that Two main findings here is that for all three of the active interventions, memory, reasoning, speed, that participants who had higher scores in healthcare access and quality fared better in terms of lower incident dementia than those who had lower scores on that variable. And similarly, for reasoning training, those who had higher education access, a better neighborhood and built environment, and more social and community context, a better social and community context, did better in terms of lower dementia incidence than those who had lower scores on those social determinants of health. But just to summarize quickly, the social determinants of health results for this study, again, greater access to medical resources was associated with lower hazards of dementia, diagnosed ADRD in all three training arms. Greater access to education, higher occupational status moderated the effects of reasoning and speed training, and neighborhood and built environment, social community context domain moderated the effects of reasoning training, but not the effects of speed, memory, or speed training. So in terms of conclusions and recommendations, there were fewer significance of social determinants of health as moderators of ADRD risk and cognitive training effects than we expected. But overall, individuals from disadvantaged neighborhoods benefited less from the active interventions. And the cognitive training designed to prevent or delay ADRD onset needs to consider disparities through SDOH channels to ensure equitable benefits. And so it really calls for culturally tailoring the interventions to increase their salience to the everyday lives of low SES individuals and identify barriers to participation. And you note here a review that we did in the Gerontologist that there has not been proportional representation of ethnic racial minority groups in cognitive training, with a few notable exceptions, active being one of them, and the senior-wise study by Graham McDougall being another one that had proportional representation. This is changing slowly, but we have a lot of work to do in this area. And then because of the high prevalence of dementia and the disparities across racial ethnic groups, there's been increasing public interest in dementia risk reduction. The Lancet Commission recently published their latest in a series of reports. And in theory, they say that at least half of dementias could be prevented or eliminated by eliminating 14 risk factors that you see on the right-hand side of the slide. They added vision loss, as I mentioned, and high LDL cholesterol this time. And the occurrence of these risk factors varies across individuals and different areas of the country and across countries, but they tend to cluster around inequities. And we really need to address these inequities in the field of dementia risk reduction. And I would argue that that limits to what cognitive training and other lifestyle interventions can achieve if social determinants of health contextual factors are not considered. And so I think what this really argues for is a public health agenda to embed these cognitive training interventions within sort of a broader social context of structural change at more of a population level. So with that, I'll close and thank my many colleagues in the active trial and colleagues across the country on other studies, and my funders, particularly the National Institute on Aging, that has made this work possible. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. We will not do questions now. We'll go on to our next speaker. She is Dr. Anja Pahor of Northeastern University and I just lost the slide that told me, the University of Maribor. Please, Dr. Pahor.
Apologies, thank you. Okay, can you hear me? So today I will be talking about mediators and moderators of working memory training and executive function training more broadly. So as shown in the first webinar, there are several different conceptual frameworks underlying training gains. And for the purpose for this talk, I will focus on the capacity efficiency model. So according to this model, there are several different categories of moderating variables that can affect both training and transfer. And these are intervention specific, so this has to do with the different training conditions or training tasks that are used. They can be between person, age, biological predisposition, personality, and so on. It is very interesting to examine within-person moderators, so how fluctuations in, say, motivation or well-being on a given day affect learning during training. And finally, the environment of the intervention is also important. And even though all of these are fascinating today, I will focus just on a few intervention-specific and between-person moderators. So a systematic review of 20 executive function training studies in older adults suggested that this type of training promotes cognitive and neural enhancements in old age. They also observed increases in cortical and subcortical tissue volume as a function of training, as well as some changes in functional connectivity in higher order brain networks. But as this is often the case, consistent improvements were shown on trained tasks, but mixed improvements were found on untrained tasks. So more research is needed to determine the best training conditions for achieving broader improvements in untrained tasks. And they also looked at a number of different moderators across different levels of transfer, so separately for near and far transfer and for different domains of transfer. And while there was no consistent pattern of moderation across these different levels of transfer, for far transfer specifically, two main moderators emerged, and these are training type and age. So multi-domain training studies seem to produce larger effect sizes than single-domain training studies. And multi-domain training studies in this case involve both multi-cognitive studies and studies involving video games. As for age, it was shown that samples with, on average, higher mean age showed larger effect sizes than those with somewhat younger, older participants. And these findings that are related to age likely have to do with baseline cognitive status, as we know that working memory declines as a function of healthy aging. And there are two different hypotheses related to baseline abilities, as alluded in the previous talk. So there's the compensation account, which suggests that individuals with lower baseline of ability have more room for improvement and will therefore gain most from cognitive training. And then there's the magnification account, which states that individuals with higher baseline ability have more efficient cognitive resources and will therefore gain most from these types of interventions. And support for the magnification account suggests preservation of neuroplasticity in working memory and executive function to very old age. But we also see studies supporting the compensation account. So why is this the case? Why do we see these mixed findings? It's likely that the effectiveness of cognitive training depends on the complex interplay of these initial baseline abilities, the nature of the intervention, and then how outcomes are measured, which leads to mixed evidence for both accounts. And since cognitive training can be quite long and taxing, it's not uncommon to see high dropout rates or poor adherence. So it is important to examine mediators and moderators of training adherence. And in this large-scale online working memory training study, which was open to all individuals over the age of 18, our colleague looked at various different individual difference factors that might predict training adherence. And while higher education, higher level of grit, and higher conscientiousness did predict training adherence, so they were positively related to training adherence, the effect sizes were quite small. So none of these factors seem to reliably predict adherence to cognitive training. And in a sample of college students this time that completed a working memory training intervention, we saw that participants who have higher level of openness and stronger baseline working memory capacity were more likely to be classified as this high-performing group. So this study was not focused on training adherence, but training performance. And this group shown with this green line could be predicted by baseline working memory and openness. But this was a sample of college students. There are some studies that show that openness, which involves curiosity and broad-mindedness, is associated with benefiting more from cognitive training, also in older adults. Interestingly, these two somewhat lower performing groups, for these, the two factors that were the most predictive were openness again and video game playing frequency. And while these types of moderators can help us understand for whom cognitive training will produce the greatest benefits, mediators can help us understand underlying mechanisms of transfer. So we examined this in 3, again, working memory training studies involving adults, mainly college students. And we found that the extent of transfer to an untrained and-back task, the training itself also involved and-back training, mediated far transfer to matrix reasoning task. And other control moderators, such as this inhibitory control task, did not show the same pattern of results. And this was also replicated in a different sample. So this result may help explain some of the variability seen in the literature in terms of far transfer. And it also suggests that it's important to include these nearest transfer tasks because they can tell us something about potential far transfer. And another factor, this time intervention-specific factor that can affect learning, is gamification. So to boost engagement, standard cognitive tasks are often gamified. And research suggests that gamification can benefit motivation, it can induce positive emotions, and boost learning performance. But it's important to bear in mind that gamification can also have a negative effect. Especially if it's not applied properly. It could lead to a lack of understanding. It could reduce motivation and just worsen performance overall. So if the game elements are distracting from the main cognitive task, then or not integrated well, then the effect can be less than what we wanted to achieve. And overall, there's very little research that systematically compares the effects of gamification on training progress and subsequent transfer. And moreover, it's unclear how individual differences in responsiveness to gamification then affects training outcomes. So in an ongoing pre-registered randomized control trial involving older adults, we are examining these effects. So the effects of gamification of working memory training tasks on learning and transfer. And as you can see, among older adults, we see better training progress in the non-game condition, which is marked with this blue line, compared to the game condition. So the game is not better, even though some might hypothesize that this would be always the case. And while both groups show statistically significant gains on an untrained and-back task, so a near transfer task, the non-game group showed significantly higher gains compared to the game group. And interestingly, there doesn't seem to be a strong preference for either game or non-game training based on a survey that we administered. And in terms of individual differences in responsiveness to gamification, we actually hypothesized that for some individuals, gamification might have a positive impact, particularly for those individuals with high baseline levels of inhibitory control. Whereas for older adults with lower baseline levels of inhibitory control, gamification might actually hinder learning as these added game elements become distractions, essentially. And this hypothesis was also pre-registered. So based on some preliminary findings, we were able to confirm this hypothesis. So it appears that baseline inhibitory control moderates the relationship between training condition, which is either random assignment to game or non-game conditions, and transfer to a working memory task after controlling for age, gender, and baseline abilities. And as you can see here, when split into two groups, the high IC group performs similarly, whereas individuals with low baseline inhibitory control assigned to the game condition show little to no transfer on this working memory task. And these findings suggest that it's important to consider the interplay between intervention-specific moderators and between person moderators, such as baseline cognitive skills. Okay, so to summarize, it appears as though age, baseline cognitive abilities, certain personality factors, and video game experience, as well as intervention-specific factors such as gamification, influence training effectiveness. And it's important to understand how these interact. And to briefly talk about our overarching themes of this webinar series, it does not seem that cognitive training is fully generalizable across different groups. So customization might be needed. We should make more effort to recruit diverse populations, as stated by Dr. Rebok. And I would suggest administering these nearest transfer tasks to get a glimpse on how participants are doing, because if they're not able to even show gains on these nearest transfer tasks, then we really shouldn't expect any far transfer effects. We should continue to examine individual differences. I didn't talk about this very much, but it's very important to assess long-term effects with follow-up sessions, and to get the best results with gamification, especially with older adults. It is important to involve them in co-design. And with that, I would like to thank everyone for your attention. Dr. Yaki and Dr. Seitz, my collaborators, as well as our funders, NIA and NIH. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Pahor. That was very interesting. We turn now to Dr. Chandramallika Basak, who's coming to us from the University of Texas at Dallas. Dr. Basak, please take it away.
I'm sorry, I'm having trouble sharing the screen. So let me just see if I can. It's asking that Zoom should get permission. Okay, now it should work. Sorry.
Dr. Basak, I can share your slides on your behalf, and you can just tell me when to advance. It does seem that we lost Dr. Basak.
It seems that way to me too. We hope that Dr. Basak will join us again, but for the moment, perhaps we can go ahead with the presentation of Dr. Katz. Sorry to do that to you, Dr. Katz. We're hoping that you're ready to step up. Dr. Benjamin Katz comes to us from Virginia Tech. Are you ready and able to go forward?
Let us find out.
Okay,
Can you see that? Is that working?
it is working.
Fantastic. All right, no problem. We'll see if cognitive training helped me with being able to switch efficiently to doing this earlier. Well, thank you so much for the warm introduction, and I am so happy to be able to share with you today. I think I wanted to focus on something slightly different as we kind of go into this. And part of my question or thinking about this is, a lot of the discussion we'll have today is about cognitive training as an intervention, which I still think is quite interesting. But one of the things I've been thinking a lot about quite a bit more is cognitive training's utility in some other contexts. And I think that's also a very interesting question as we think about moderators and mediators of that cognitive training. And so I want to leave everyone with a couple of maybe additional points, one more methodological, one maybe more broader conceptual point as everyone thinks about these issues. But to start, right, my own work, as I got started in academia and research more generally, was focused on exactly these questions. I was very, very interested in different moderators, especially motivational and contextual factors. So some of the things that I had looked at earlier, and I still think are very relevant, and some of the same things, right, that have already been discussed today, things like the design of the training. So as Dr. Pahor mentioned, the gamification or game design elements, things like socioeconomic status. In this case, it was a proxy measure for your reduced price lunch, but I'll talk about that in a minute. Also things like whether someone was compensated with money for the training, or if they came to the training program out of a desire, maybe an intrinsic motivation to improve cognitive functioning. And things like motivational state, how motivated somebody reported being while they were completing the intervention. And we found some differential effects of whether these individual factors influenced the outcomes of training. So for example, this is from one of those studies. This is the one that looked at game design and motivational features in the game. This was a study that was done in Michigan with children and adolescents completing an after-school program where they did a few sessions of cognitive training with several different variants of games. And you can see on the bottom axis, these are all the different variants of these games, some of which had all of the motivational features that includes things like having lives or levels, a changing theme, prizes, points, right? That's a very common thing that are included in games. You can go back all the way to some Space Fortress is that one, some very early cognitive training programs, and see that they had points or lives and levels. And this was one of those examples, right, where the result was surprising. We found that the outcome of training was related to the design, the training performance specifically, but it was actually something where all of the motivational features did worse than removing some of them. So, some of those motivational features like showing lives or levels or having points displayed on the screen actually had some deleterious effects on people's performance. And just noting, right, this is training performance rather than transfer effects. Some of my other work, right, we found different results. So for example, in another study, this is a large study that was actually across the United States of children completing a cognitive training program actually for a pretty extensive period of time. We were interested in seeing if free reduced price lunch, this is actually school level free reduced price lunch, was related to individuals' transfer on that. And this was one where we expected that we might see an effect. Of course, there's different, free reduced price lunch is related to all these different things, including like people's experience with technology and things like that. But we didn't actually find, in this case, any real connection between the socioeconomic status and the actual training outcome. You can see, right, on the left is the control condition, on the right is the experimental group that actually did the cognitive training. While there were baseline differences where people started off on these standardized EF measures, there wasn't any sort of dramatic difference in how much people improved after the intervention period as a function of whether they were in the, and it might be hard to see on there because I realize the SES levels are each of those shaded, different shaded sections of the bar. But you can see that between, if you go from the white one to the other white one and from the middle one to the other middle one, that there's not massive differences in how much people improved as a function of whether they were high or low amounts of free or reduced price lunch in a school. Another study where we didn't see massive differences from these moderator type effects were ones where we were looking at whether people were compensated or whether they joined the study as a result of intrinsic motivation. This is one where actually the real manipulation was a poster that we put up that was either advertising getting paid for the study or joining a study that was, and being able to do it out of a desire to improve cognitive functioning. And this was another one where we didn't really see differences between the paid and unpaid group in the training performance. And we also didn't see differences in how much somebody improved at some of these reasoning batteries that we included. Again, I'll note though that we did see some baseline differences. So there were differences in sort of who came in, right? There were significant group differences in sort of where people started on those reasoning measures as a function of whether they were in the group that was recruited through being paid versus the group that was intrinsic motivation, but it didn't impact necessarily how much they actually improved as a function of the training. And finally, of some other studies, this is, I won't talk about this too much because it was a TDCS study also, but some other studies where we looked at, say, motivational orientation and how much motivation was related with training improvements per se, and we found more mixed effects where it wasn't quite clear in these different contexts exactly what was, how or motivation may have operated differently. So I don't want to talk about all that too much because I really want to return to this really more conceptual and methodological questions. So a lot of these earlier studies were ad hoc, looking at, you could categorize them in different ways depending on outcomes, whether it was training performance or real world activities or untrained EF tasks. And of course, the intervening variables can be quite different, right? That we can be looking at moderators that are impacting the strength of direction or mediators that should be explaining the association. So my first point that I want to really make, though, is focused on this question of what we're actually doing when we look at these moderators and mediators. So thinking about all those different constructs and variables that were operationalized in all of the studies my colleagues have discussed today, and they're really excellent work, right? I want to keep in mind what those variables actually mean, what they can tell us, and also some questions that I think is worth asking as we think about them, especially in the context of trying to use those variables in ways that might actually help us improve the outcomes of interventions. And so I don't know if any other people here have seen this. This is from some of Yuko Mudakata's work. And this is not about cognitive training per se. This is more looking at different factors, contextual, environmental factors, social factors that might be influencing someone's executive functioning, and therefore in turn might then impact other outcomes that we think are related to executive function. And one of the reasons I just wanted to share this chart is because a lot of those moderators and mediators we've talked about, right, may be connected broadly to some of these other factors. And I think it's important to keep in mind, when we look at a moderator or mediator, what is it really telling us? And what maybe do we know about it? What is maybe missing sometimes when we reduce it or operationalize it to something that we can include in actual analysis? So for example, the free or reduced price lunch that I was talking about before, right? That's a proxy for SES, but it's really related to so many other things that might be linked to both the external environment, if you think about actual makeup of a school, internal state factors here, but also developmental or experiential factors, genetic factors, things that, it can be really, really hard to, not necessarily for SES, but for some of the other factors we might talk about, it can be really hard to separate out some of those things, right? So for example, in some places I've lived, free or reduced price lunch might be related also to neurotoxin exposure, but that's not necessarily something you might be looking at in the study. And so I think it's just really important because you want to keep in mind if you're trying to use some of these factors to maybe change or modify or personalize an intervention, keep in mind that that changing that one thing, it might be something else that's associated with that actually is what you need to look at. So just a word of caution. But then I want to think through something else as sort of my last point in my portion of this, which is if we're focused on cognitive training's utility as an intervention, these moderators and mediators can be useful to explain why somebody may or may not benefit from the intervention. These are all things that may or may not be modifiable, right? Or they may be more or less easily modifiable. But they also might be highly specific to the intervention itself, right? Some of them, if you think about how easily could you generalize these moderation or mediation effects, some of them might be very easily generalizable to a specific, to other types of interventions, and others may be really specific just to that one intervention, the way it was used, given the duration, et cetera, et cetera. And so this is not going to be new or a surprise to anyone, right? But I kind of want to back up to thinking about cognitive training much more generally, because I don't want us to forget the utility potentially of these moderation and mediation factors and thinking about them in cognitive training much more broadly defined, right? I think people are broadly familiar with the testing the limits work, right, which was really more examining cognitive plasticity rather than necessarily looking at cognitive training as sort of a intervention that would lead to a whole bunch of other effects. And this is something that I've thought about in my own work. This is some work I did with Rebecca Rhodes, where we looked at sort of in a similar way, not at practice on, say, a memory strategy test or a memory exercise, but this is a working memory, right, NBAC level, and we were able to look at this by age. And as I did some of this work, this got me thinking about my second point. Of course, we saw that age, of course, was a heavily influencer, right, on the not only baseline effects on the working memory task, but also learning on that task over time, which is really to what extent these moderation and mediation effects are generalizable to other interventions. And the reason I got interested in this, following up from that other study, a lot of my work now is really focused on lifestyle interventions or interventions with lifestyle behavior targets. So this is an example from some work that I've done with Allison Miller's group at the University of Michigan, where there was an NBAC, a working memory component to this intervention. This was used with children that were in the Detroit area. Part of it was focused on obesity outcomes for a broad set of children. And then there was a more specific sample I'll talk about with type 1 diabetes that was also recruited. And there in this project, we had not only NBAC training, but also a biofeedback program, an episodic future thinking program. There's an approach avoidance. And one of the things that I started doing as I thought about this question was, well, these are each very different types of interventions. And the information we get about each of these different types of interventions, the amount of control we had over the interventions also varies. So in that one study I was just showing from Allison Miller's group, we didn't find a huge effect of the interventions overall on the primary outcomes, but I did start looking to see whether some of these mediating, moderating factors, how might they influence these other types of programs? Because when I looked at cognitive training, you can sometimes see that people's performance on the cognitive training program, sometimes even very early on in that cognitive training, might inform both the engagement and dosage and compliance with the other interventions, especially that was a factorial design, so some people did the NBAC training first. But also, given that it sometimes was very predictive of people's performance on other types of interventions, I thought, well, maybe it'd be interesting to see if we could learn a little bit about how some of these moderator and mediators, do they influence the NBAC training? Do they also then influence the outcome of the other interventions? So for example, emotional self-efficacy, we found when I just looked at this more recently, I had a similar effect on the outcome of the NBAC training, the guided meditation, the episodic future thinking. This is about the compliance or gain on the intervention itself. But other factors like diabetes, family conflict, this isn't the type 1 diabetes arm of this program, right? They actually didn't have the same impact across all of these different intervention types. And this has been something that's been on my mind because I can see some utility for this type of thing. If, for example, you could give somebody a very short amount of cognitive training that might help you inform how someone might respond to other types of interventions that may be much longer or harder to control. Of course, all of this hinges a great deal on this larger question about what actually happens when someone practices a task, what's changing, what is training performance actually predicting, right? That's part of the reason I think the question about the, say, for example, the capacity efficiency model, right, that seems quite relevant because whether you're actually improving capacity or efficiency seems to be something that might be very important in the context of this type of question. And so my last kind of exhortation, why I think it's so important to focus on this, is because Cognitive training may have more limited utility as an intervention by itself, at least when you compare it, right, to things like cardiovascular exercise or diet. A lot of the work we're doing in the lab, we're even looking at water or hydration practices in executive function. But that being said, cognitive training can be very carefully controlled, and almost every aspect of someone's performance on a cognitive training program can be very carefully examined, oftentimes in ways that you can't in other types of interventions. And so I think that understanding the factors that moderate or mediate cognitive training outcomes might let us more efficiently understand the factors that can influence other interventions, including potentially longer or harder to measure programs. But I think to be really confident about this, and for this to be really maybe a future direction for this work, we still need to better understand whether performance in a cognitive training program is a reasonable assay of plasticity, and or if it's a predictor of how one might respond to different types of interventions. I know lots of other people are thinking about this question as well. And with that, I want to thank everyone and the organizers for the opportunity to talk. Here's some of my colleagues on this varied work, and some of the NIH grants that have supported my previous and current work in looking at interventions to improve executive function.
Dr. Katz, thank you so much. And thank you especially for jumping in when needed, when our prior speaker had trouble. So now I think we have Dr. Chandramallika Basak back with us from the University of Texas at Dallas. Let's hope you have better luck this time. Take it away.
Thank you, and thanks for sharing the slide on my behalf. So today I'll be talking about mediators such as brain plasticity, as well as moderators that might be contributors to the prevention of Alzheimer's disease. The next slide, please. The primary goal of prevention of AD or AD-related dementia is to reduce the incidence rate of AD-ADRD amongst healthy older adults who possess one or more major risk factors. Now we know that one of the major risk factors, or the most significant risk factor, is age, with the likelihood of developing AD doubling every 5 years after the age of 65. And it's reflected or accompanied by these rate of cognitive declines that you see on your left from the Dallas Lifespan Brain Aging Study from our colleagues, where you can see that the skills such as whose training is very beneficial in the long term, and working memory training that we heard from previous speakers as well as episodic long-term memory that seem to steadily change across cross-sectionally across this lifespan sample, but the world knowledge, semantic knowledge seems to improve and stabilizes after 65. And these kind of abilities lead us to think about this model that has been proposed by eminent researchers in the field, that if we think about chronological age on the right, and then on the cognition on the y-axis, the idea of cognitive training, if we click on, if we could click, thank you. If there is a functional threshold of dementia, so another click, please. The idea of the cognitive training is that, hey, what if we can maintain cognition for at least 5 years so that we can delay the onset of dementia? And what I'm going to show you at the end of this presentation, hopefully or throughout the presentation, is that brain structures, particularly white matter integrities, one example is the genu, but white matter integrity as well as gray matter volumes of prefrontal areas do seem to show maintenance. And on the other hand, if we do another click, it would be great if cognitive training could help us improve cognition. So what we are seeing in a few of the randomized clinical trials that we did is that the improvements in cognition, or the increase in capacity that Dr. Katz was saying right before, is mediated by the maintenance of the brain structures. Can we move to the next slide, please? Right. So the efficacy of cognitive training, as we know, is the first generation research and is much needed. The efficacy and effectiveness research is designed to demonstrate that cognitive training is associated with positive cognitive outcomes. But moving forward, that is the focus of the session today, we want to think about, why do specific cognitive training strategies work? That is, what are the underlying neurocognitive mechanisms? But we also want to think about, should we train specific cognitive abilities or a broad broad range of cognitive skills. And so that answers the question of mediators. In terms of moderators, we want to think about for whom and under what circumstances will early intervention produce the greatest clinical benefits. So I'm going to talk about two, next click please. So I'm going to take two approaches, talk about results from randomized control trials, both phase 1 and phase 2 clinical trials, but also results from meta-analysis. The next slide, please. So I'm first going to talk about results from a meta-analysis. The meta-analysis on randomized control trials on both single component and the multi-component cognitive training, which means that cognitive training that focused on only one single cognitive component, such as say working memory or executive functions or reasoning, versus multi-component cognitive training, which could be video games or engagement-based, or the ones that train multiple cognitive components, either sequentially or simultaneously. The overall net gain effect size for cognitive training is 0.28. Now, it might seem that it's a small number, but this is a different type of analysis that we did. If we click another time, and one more, please. So the analysis that we conducted in this current meta-analysis, the net gain effect size is different than typical gain HSG. So net gain effect size is almost like looking at interaction, how much the training group is improving compared to the control group. So 0.28 is actually comparable to what the physical fitness interventions look like if they actually did the net gain effect size, because their control group is also showing improvements, right? So in this meta-analytic review, one more click, please. We reviewed 215 cognitive training studies on both healthy aging and adults, older adults with mild cognitive impairments. And one of the goals that we wanted to ask, if we click one more time, was to see who benefits most from cognitive training. So if we think about if you have more room to improve, such as those with MCI, would they show greater benefits from cognitive training, or is it that high ability model that the rich get richer? So if we click once more, the results would show up. What we saw, one more click, please. What you see here is that the net gain effect size, which is comparing the gains in training versus the gains in control within the same RCT, the effect sizes are comparable for MCI versus healthy aging. There is no significant difference between the healthy aging and the MCI groups. If you look at the cognitive constructs, the outcome measures, there was no significant difference between the healthy aging and MCI. They improved pretty much in all these cognitive outcomes, including everyday functioning. So you can see that we also looked at everyday functioning. The next slide, please. So for whom will cognitive training produce the most benefit? We did this moderator analysis. We looked at categorical moderators that were analyzed via subgroup analysis, and the continuous moderators were subjected to meta-regression analysis. We looked at these particular characteristics. We wanted to look at the participant characteristics. I already showed you the results of mental health status, healthy aging versus MCI. We wanted to look at person female in the study, average age, given that age is the most significant risk factor, years of education. We also looked at training characteristics, training duration, training frequency. Where are you training, at home versus laboratory? Because there have been, questions about, the validity of at-home training, adaptive versus non-adaptive training, because, gamification, does the gamification, is it really needed in terms of training related benefits? Those kind of questions can be answered by looking at these meta-analysis. We also looked at control characteristics when you have passive control versus an active control. We looked at publication characteristics such as PEDRO scores and number of cognitive outcomes reported. And if we do one more click, you can see that, and one more click, please. What we see here are two significant effects out of all these characteristics that we looked at. The years of education, and in fact, it was in the opposite direction. So the more years of education, the average, for the, average years of education of the participants in the study was, the smaller the effect size was. If we click once more, and one more. So what you see is that this overall effect is really coming from the healthy aging studies, not so much from NCI. probably is not because of lack of power, because you can see from the dots that there are enough studies. So less formal education leads to greater benefit. If we go to the next slide, where we are looking at the number of cognitive outcomes reported, the results look very similar. The more number of cognitive outcomes reported, the smaller the effect size seems to be. So if we click once more and once more, again, the studies seem to be showing significance in healthy aging. Larger number of outcomes tended to have a relatively smaller effect size. The next slide, please. The next question is that, should we train specific cognitive abilities or broad range of cognitive skills? Some systematic reviews seem to have suggested that maybe we should train broad range of cognitive skills to get far transfer and not specific cognitive abilities. If we look here, we looked at single component training and multi-component training. And we also looked at everyday functioning, which is the last line in each of these blocks of images. So if we go to the next click, as expected, we see, bigger far near transfer than far transfer. That's no surprise. But if you look at the single component training for the near transfer, it was significant for all training modules. So that's not a surprise. But if we go down one more, far transfer was most significant and robust for executive function / working memory training. We had grouped them together. And if you look at multi-component training, all modules had significant near and far transfer. Altogether, it seems that the executive function / working memory training was most robust and most significant effect size in terms of both near and far transfer. We go further. So this led us to this idea that, hey, executive function / working memory training seems to be promising, but is there a better training strategy? So that led us to this NIA-funded phase 1 clinical trial where we looked at 2 versions of Birdwatch game. One is predictable and one is unpredictable. If we move forward. So we had 3 groups, but I'm going to ignore the other 2 groups. I'm just going to focus on the 2 greens. And so we had 21 participants and 22 participants, and we had 20 completers and 19 completers. This was done during the COVID. So we had only 15 and 13 in each group on whom we could get the MRI scans, but we had all the behavioral results and the pretty much majority of the participants. The next slide, please. This study came from this idea that we had tested in 2016, where we used a completely non-adaptive approach where people did 1, 2, 3, 4 back. It was actually not N back. It was something called N match task, where either people got unpredictable Q expectancies or predictable Q expectancies with a 50% switch and 50% non-switch in both conditions. And what you see here is that unpredictable group showed greater transfer to measure of episodic memory compared to the predictable group. And this is all done on older adults. And they only did 5 hours of training. Next slide, please. Another click, please. So in this study, we also looked at how the baseline cognition is correlated with learning rates during the task for both predictable group and unpredictable group. Another click, please. And what you see here is that the relationship holds true only for the unpredictable training. The higher switch cost, the the lower switch cost, the faster the rate of learning. Another click, please. We also found that the individuals who have another click, please, that only in the unpredictable group, we found that the relationship between the learning rate and the cognitive gains in both near transfer and far transfer. The next slide, please. Thank you. So this research led to the development of the Birdwatch game Unity. We have this first slide, on the right, where participants log in, and then every day when they do the training, they also have to put in how many hours of sleep they had, and how was their mood, how was the stress level, how busy they were, how was their general physical health. It's the unified modeling language of the BWGU is there. The pre-patent is approved, and we have just submitted the final patent. And in a publication, we reported the learning rates, and you can see a lot of variability in the older adults and the learning rate. What is important to know is that within first 5 hours, which is shaded in green, people reach near asymptotic performance, and they don't gain so much after that. The next slide, please. So when we think about the mediators, we want to think about why do specific cognitive training strategies work. One argument from Loveden et al. Has been the cognitive plasticity idea, that to see cognitive plasticity, it has to be associated with underlying structural and functional changes of the brain. Otherwise, they call it the cognitive flexibility. So my research includes the following mediators: gray matter volume, cortical thickness, white matter integrity, fMRI activation, and functional connectivity for both task and resting state. The next slide, please. This is the result from the phase 1 clinical trial that I showed you. What we see here is that maintenance of gray matter volumes in in the unpredictable group compared to the predictable group in lateral, frontal, and parietal regions of the brain. And those are also correlated, as you see in the heat map, with the gains in cognition. And these are construct approach of cognition. Another click, please. One more. And we also saw in the groups with the unpredictable training showing increased white matter connectivity in left posterior and superior corona radiata, which kind of connects the caudate to the parietal regions of the brain. The next slide, please. The further evidence of brain plasticity is also from another clinical trial. This is headed by Dr. Hinkyu Lee at Posit Science, where we had 120 older adults who completed training across 2 sites in UT Dallas and University of Iowa. After 10 weeks of training, we see greater improvements in Brain HQ training group in overall cognition. Click, please. And we also saw greater maintenance of the caudate volume in the Brain HQ group. Again, it's a maintenance story, and greater maintenance of white matter integrity in left SLF and internal capsule. Next slide, please. We also have done fMRI meta-analysis, which seems to suggest that with executive function training, you see changes in these regions of the brain. And we also see in the other slide the changes in within network connectivity. Next slide, please.
Dr. Basak, you're at time now. Can I ask you to wrap it up? I'm so sorry.
Yeah. Yes. We can move on to the last slide. Yeah, we can. So we can just move forward, and this is the conclusion. So we see that cognitive training is improving everyday cognition. The most promising approach is EF training. Significant moderators are education in number of cognitive outcomes. We are looking at EF training, which seems to suggest that we see default mode network, FP, and salience network to be the mediator of these cognitive training effects. And so the future directions are to continue along this path, and I'm happy to answer questions during the Q&A session. Thank you.
Dr. Basak, thank you very much. And thank you for being with us despite, I can hear you have a tickle in your throat and Zoom has been torturing you. So special credit to you for joining us under the circumstances. So now we have a number of questions that the steering committee has put together. And I believe that the first few are just generally directed to the panel, to anybody who wants to respond. So if you can put your cameras back on, let me read you the first question, and whoever wants to can jump in, and keep your answers relatively brief so we have enough time for everybody who wants to jump in. The first of the steering panel's questions is as follows. One of the most intuitive moderators of cognitive training is training adherence. Former Surgeon General C. Everett Koop said, drugs don't work in patients who don't take them. And analogously, cognitive training doesn't work for people who don't engage with it. So for all of you, what lessons have you learned related to promoting adherence, reducing barriers to adherence, and the impact of adherence on outcomes? What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, I could address that. In the active study, we had very high levels of adherence, over 90% to the initial training, over 95% to the booster training. I think we did several things to promote adherence. We maintained a very flexible training schedule. We provided makeup sessions. There were only 10 sessions. We had reminder calls. We provided transportation to get to the training site. There was rigorous monitoring of adherence by the study staff, including recording of when people would show up at the sessions and leave the sessions. And the content of the interventions also played a role. We had a lot of everyday kind of examples and use of strategies that had everyday relevance. And we also made the training at least partially adaptive, so it kept it interesting for the participants. And that was really, I think, a critical factor in its effectiveness and cost effectiveness. I think that, the small group intervention also played a role. A lot of social engagement, people really bonded to the facilitator and to their group members, lots of opportunities for practice and feedback. And we really tried to get participants to grasp the overall sort of sense of the training. They realized that this was a large study, it was a significant study, and they weren't just in there to practice sort of cognitive exercises, but sort of what the broader meaning of those exercises really meant to them in their everyday life. And we also tried to adapt the training for people with visual difficulties and with auditory difficulties to make it accessible. And in fact, the adherence was so good, it kind of a two-edged sword, though, in terms of studying adherence. There was only, limited power in terms of detecting an effect because there was not a lot of variability in adherence. But we tried a lot of things to promote adherence, and we were glad that we had such high levels of adherence.
All right, great, thank you. Anyone else want to comment on that particular question?
Really briefly, so the study that I presented where we paid participants versus not paying participants that was one where I didn't show this, but one of the big differences was actually in attrition from the study, or to say big, but I think meaningful or notable differences. And that was something where I think, you have to be a little cautious, right? Because so who is dropping out, who is leaving in that context? I think that, and also what is compensation doing, who's actually coming into your study? I think that's maybe not a little bit less. I think that you can ask the question about adherence or how to promote adherence, but I think another way of looking at it is also thinking about how all these factors influence who actually ends up in your intervention or ends up staying there too.
Great, thank you. Okay. Let me go to the next question then. Moderators are often explored in cognitive training studies when no overall effective training is observed. The idea being the intervention didn't work overall, but maybe it worked for a subset of participants. However, this can run the risk of type 1 errors. How do we balance the exploration of moderators and the risk of false alarms? Anybody want to jump up and respond to that?
I can address this briefly. So I think we're at the stage where we can really start pre-registering hypotheses about specific moderators rather than engaging these post hoc explorations. And then if we do that, use various correction techniques.
Yeah, I can address that one as well. I think there is this exploratory feel about a moderator analysis, and I completely agree about sort of pre-registering predictions. I think that it's sort of using parallel sets of analysis. We did that in those 3 who benefits studies that I showed you. We used latent growth curve modeling analyses with a common set of moderators across interventions to try to answer that question of who benefits. And trying to just guard against these false alarms, I think by, repeated testing and replication analysis is something that'll help, guard against these false alarms that you often see.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else want to comment on that one?
I think another approach could be to actually build in the moderators that you're interested in the study design explicitly. So if I'm interested in education as a moderator, maybe I should recruit high education and low education. We do that with pulse pressure. We have high pulse pressure and low pulse pressure, and then we're looking at the cognitive training gains to address the cardiovascular disease is probably a potential moderator. So we can build it into design, and we can look at time series analysis, another kind of analysis where you can look at day-to-day variability of how sleep and other variables are predicting not only today's performance, but tomorrow's performance and later performance. So there are really cool ways to look at it without making it look exploratory.
Great. All right. Thank you. One more question. This is from Dr. Yagi. How can we use what all of you have learned about mediators and moderators to personalize interventions in real time? What would be the potential risks in such personalized approaches? So what do you all think about that?
I mean, I think that's a really important question. I think, and maybe this is part of what I was talking about. So the risk I see, right, is that the thing that you've identified as a moderator and mediator, which seems to have some statistical association with the outcome of that training, is not the thing that you actually want to. It may be very closely associated with it, but it may not be the thing that actually you need to modify or change, or the thing that you actually want to modify or change may not even be something that you can modify or change. So that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be looking at these moderators or mediators, but sometimes I think we have to step back or maybe even do additional research to really examine the different factors or related factors or interplay between different experiential or contextual or environmental things that we actually think might be related to, hey, say something like free reduced-price lunch or any other motivational or moderator mediator that people have talked about today. And so I think that's the real risk, right? Is you might think this seems like it's a really important and statistically meaningful predictor, but it may not be the thing that you want to personalize or change in affecting that outcome.
Right. Thank you. Anyone else want to comment on this one?
I think from mediator perspective, some ways of individualizing individualized approaches can work. So for example, one hypothesis we have been looking at is the default mode network hypothesis, that the greater suppression of default mode network through different approaches, whether it be physical fitness, whether it be unpredictable working memory training, or through mindfulness meditation. There are different approaches. And if you see the similar kind of idea that these, approaches are leading to the same kind of network changes, then you can think about individualized training, that somebody might prefer mindfulness training and somebody might prefer cognitive training because they have physical disability, and then somebody might prefer physical fitness.
Got it. Okay. Any other comments on that one? Okay.
Yeah, maybe I can add that. If we're kind of focusing on real-time adjustments, we could use some data-driven models to adjust the intervention based on this real-time input from participants. So for example, and not just, continue on. So if a participant is stagnating over the past 10 minutes, not getting any correct answers, maybe a break could be introduced, I don't know, with a short, even motivational conversation with a AI chatbot, or stopping the session if they're really feeling tired, and then just adjusting the session so that they're able to perform at their best. But this also comes with certain risks that are because we're over relying on AI potentially.
Yeah. Interesting. Thank you. All right, here is a question from Susan Yagi, specifically for Professor Rebok. She writes, I'm fascinated to see the differential impact of individual differences on types of training. What's your recommendation on how we should use those findings for the development of new cognitive interventions?
I think that's an excellent question. I think, it's very hard to predict which these individual differences will predict differential outcomes across different interventions. So I think that, we need to certainly, I think, understand more about sort of consistency of prediction across interventions. And I think a lot of this begins really with recruitment and sort of re-looking at our recruitment strategies, our exclusionary practices. I think a lot of times, we make a priori assumptions about who we recruit into studies and their ability to benefit. And I think we have a lot of under-recognized individual difference variables that we really should be paying attention to. I mentioned, sensory impairment. we found that vision impairment seemed to impact on the effectiveness of reasoning training, perhaps because of the complexity of the visual stimuli. But that's an opportunity also for, doing a compensatory kind of training. I think doing a lot more pre-training, sort of tuning people up to benefit from cognitive interventions is something that we can do. I think mental health is another variable that we've not really built into interventions. We've done a series of studies on the effects of depression. Many people who are depressed are excluded from cognitive training studies, but depression, we found that people, particularly in memory and reasoning and speed training, seem to be able to benefit just as much as people who are non-depressed from cognitive training interventions, even though they still see intercept differences. So there again, that's an opportunity, I think, to build in some depressive, antidepressive kind of interventions into cognitive training. And take advantage of that rather than engage in these kind of exclusionary practices that I think has sort of characterized the field.
Oh, that's fantastic. That's a really interesting idea. Thank you. Here's a question from Luke Stokel. There's a recommendation, and I think this is to the group generally. There's a recommendation to culturally tailor the interventions to increase their salience to everyday lives of low SES individuals and identify barriers to participation. Is there a role for co-design here? If so, could you comment on how we might approach cognitive training, intervention design, and testing differently using a co-design approach versus cultural tailoring of existing interventions? So whoever wants could take a crack at that.
I could start because I've just worked on a project for the EF plus math organization that was heavily involved co-design. I think co-design is essential and incredibly important. And actually, I think you actually have to ask the question. Part of what co-design can give you is figuring out from the very start if the cognitive training intervention is even the one that makes the most sense, right? You have to think about some, if you think about some of these things that we've talked about today, maybe rate limiting factors, almost like in chemistry, right? There may be other things somebody might need. Like if someone doesn't have a lot of experience with computers or video games, ask the question of, is the cognitive training the first thing that person might need to actually help improve these different functions? And sometimes those are things where you might have that idea or think that makes sense, but co-design is going to help you better understand that if that is even the most appropriate type of intervention to start with, or maybe cognitive training might work, right? But maybe it needs to follow something else first. So I think that, I guess the basic answer to that question is I think co-design can be exceptionally valuable. But maybe before you even jump into saying it's going to be an intervention that looks like X, you want to even ask questions about and work with your community partners to see if this is even something that is going to be acceptable or meaningful to start with.
Interesting. Thank you. Anybody else want to comment on that?
Yeah, I'd like to comment on that. We've taken a community engagement kind of participatory approach to this, really building partnerships with communities and not thinking of participants as sort of the objects of our intervention, but rather bringing them in very early on in the stages, conducting focus groups, conducting interviews, seeing sort of what they would prefer, what they really want to modify in terms of their cognitive performance. And I think it's really important to bring them in very early into the design and then be able to sort of revisit that as you go through the training. And it builds trust in the community. It builds trust in you as an interventionist. Also, I just want to back up a little bit and acknowledge one of our team, Allison Wong, who has been leading the work on the vision and hearing moderation effects on cognitive training. I just want to acknowledge her work in that area.
Great. Really interesting responses. It's the co-design issue is so interesting across the scientific enterprise. It's very interesting to see the specific application here. So if there's a question specifically for Dr. Pahor from Susan Yagi. I appreciate the call to recruit diverse populations. However, building off the prior question, how can we make sure that the interventions are appropriate for the individuals we aim to serve?
Yeah, this does relate to this previous question. So yeah, firstly, we really need to identify the specific needs and the challenges of a given population, involve them in co-design, like we said, and make sure that the intervention is culturally relevant. But importantly, we need to also gather feedback and continuously adjust the intervention based on the feedback that we get. And finally, I think we also need to really ensure that it is accessible so that there aren't any barriers to participation.
Sorry. Anybody else want to comment on that? Okay. I'll go in. We'll probably have time for a few more questions. Vanki Lin has a general question for everybody. Moderators from retrospective analyses can be complex to account for in research design. How can we strategically incorporate these moderators into power and sample size estimates for the next phase of a cognitive training study or for prospective design? Who wants to take a crack?
I would love to take a crack. I think I alluded to it a little bit more, and thanks for the question because I used the question as a prop to answer the previous question. As I said, we can actually introduce those moderators in the design and we can do the appropriate power analysis for it. Another moderator that is of great interest nowadays, and in fact, Dr. Lee is leading that in our phase 2B clinical trial. We're looking at the beta amyloid, but most importantly, the p-tau in the blood. And so we are looking at 5-year follow-up of our cognitive training on the p-tau, but also looking at p-tau and how that impacts the training-related gains can be used in the design a priori. And it can be a great interest in terms of Alzheimer's disease. So yeah, we can look at sleep. We can modify the design, individualize it. As we said, using AI/ML approach, let's look at 20 days of training. Let's see how the time series looks like. And now every next day when you're reporting less sleep, let's change the training design, the demands of the training a little bit less or more based on that. If sleep is the strong predictor for you, for another person, it could be stress. For another person, it could be fitness. Or for another person, what matters is how well you did the task today. Nothing else matters.
Thank you. All right, let me do another question. This is from Luke Stokel to the panel at large. In considering attention, effort, performance validity, and adherence, I wonder if the panel could comment on what's typically used to assess performance validity and account for related factors, maybe fatigue, for example. Do we look at variability in reaction times, attention catch trials, simple force choice recognition tasks? Thinking about the long history of performance validity testing and neuropsychological assessment as a starting point. So what does the group have to say to that?
I think one, we do look at reaction time variability, but one really underlooked approach, which we do in clinical psychology, is using the diffusion model of reaction time. And so that's another approach we can look at drift rate, look at the non-decision time, and look at how those, change as we train and whether certain parameters are more predictive than another through the training and at different points of training. So maybe like in first 2 hours, it's about drift rate, and maybe I'm just making this up, actually not, we do have some preliminary data, but in like first 5 hours it's about the drift diffusion rate, and then later part of the training it seems to be it's about the non-decision time. And so going beyond just scores or reaction times or accuracies, using more fine-grained measures could be one approach. I don't know whether I answered the question appropriately or not.
Okay, thank you. Other comments on that? Okay, I'll jump in. We have a question here for Dr. Rebok from Todd Horowitz. I think all of the data we've seen are on what your conceptual model refers to as proximal outcomes. Are there data of the effects of cognitive training on primary outcomes, ADLs, for instance, and do those relationships resemble those observed for the proximal outcomes?
Yeah, the whole logic of the active training model was that by moving the proximal targets, that gain then would be translated over into to the primary outcomes, which were our everyday cognition outcomes. And we had a priori hypothesis about how each of the training conditions would impact on those primary outcomes. And we've published numerous papers on the everyday cognitive outcomes, including self-reported IADL outcomes. We had a 10-year report showing that for all three of the interventions that there was reports of reduced difficulty performing everyday activities like financial management and medication management and meal preparation with people that went through the cognitive training interventions. Carleen Ball has done a lot of work on looking at driving outcomes and reduction of at-fault crashes through the useful field of view training. We've looked at healthcare expenditures, reduction of healthcare expenditures as a distal, sort of more secondary kind of outcome. So I think active is one of the studies. I mean, we, all the time we hear training studies criticized because they don't demonstrate any sort of far transfer. And I think active has demonstrated in some domains far transfer. I think there's reasons for what we baked into the intervention that help account for that. But we do have data on IADLs and other everyday kind of cognitive measures, including performance-based measures that show longer term kind of benefit from the training.
All right, great.
Thanks for the
you.
question. Great question.
Thank you for the answer. And I think we are at time. So let me then go back to Melissa Treviño, and I thank the panelists. It was a wonderfully interesting set of presentations. Thank you. So Melissa.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Tia, you're a great moderator, and thank you to our speakers. So I do want to quickly highlight our upcoming and last webinar of the series. It will be on November 6th, and it will focus on the future of cognitive training and on key questions: what can we do to make cognitive training work better? And what are novel designs that could inspire cognitive training research? And I do want to highlight GSA will also be having a webinar next Wednesday on October 23rd on 25 years of the ACTIVE study, which you've heard of today. So please tune into those. Thank you, everyone.